So, good afternoon, everybody, and I guess, and so I'm here. We are here to, talk about anti-Islamophobia, and the phenomenon of Islamophobia, of course. And it's a good opportunity because it's October and Islamic Heritage Month, and yeah. So I will jump right in to what I have to say. We're going to do actually understanding of hate and Islamophobia, how it operates. But before that, I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Mifrah Abid, and I am the coordinator of the Together Against Islamophobia program of the Coalition of Muslim Women. Other than that, I am also a podcaster. I used to be an ESL/university lecturer of English in India. I'll always identify as the hyphenated Canadian. And yeah, I'm very active on Twitter. A little bit of Coalition of Muslim Women of KW, that KW stands for Kitchener-Waterloo. It was founded in 2010 when there's this whole conversation about Bill 94, which is basically the grandmother bill of Bill 21, which is now the laicity law in Quebec. And there was a whole conversation about how veiled women, like Muslim women, wearing the hijab, which is considered a religious symbol, would not be allowed in a lot of public spheres because of this piece of cloth, which people found very offensive for some reason. And during all this debate, there was very little talk about, very few people reaching out to actual Muslim women asking what their take on this all was. And so this group of women came down together to empower Muslim women, to give them a voice, to be able to self-advocate. But on the side also, there was a focus on providing opportunities for personal and professional growth, and also, of course, addressing Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, discrimination, through all different approaches. And we also realized that gender-based violence was another issue that was impacting women so significantly. And so there's a whole other program that focuses on this. So this is what the Coalition of Muslim Women started off with about 12 years ago. We have, alhamdulillah, grown a lot since then. And this is the proof that now we have 4 very well-established programs. So I'm the coordinator of this program called Together Against Islamophobia, or TIE for short. So you can call me a TIE fighter, huge Star Wars fan. So our program, this program is addressing violence in community. There's another program called Towards Violence-Free Homes, which is addressing violence within the family. And then, of course, there's a whole youth program for disenfranchised youth. So we have the first Muslim Youth Council, Waterloo Region Muslim Youth Council, and the youth team is amazing. They're working on counter speech labs, basically countering Islamophobia through positive messaging and counter narratives. And the last program, which is like the latest edition, is Women Building Women. So we've also realized that a lot of racialized / Muslim women are economically and socially isolated and disadvantaged. And so a whole lot of bridging programs to bring them up to speed, to make them included in the to give them the skills needed to be independent economically and also socially part of the conversation. But this is what I really, really want to focus on. And my colleague Mariam Farouk is actually heading this new project, which is reportinghate.ca. So this is a one-of-a-kind service in Canada. I'll not just say Kitchener-Waterloo or Ontario, or I will say go as far as saying in Canada. So although our focus is still Kitchener-Waterloo, the work that we're doing here is in some ways very groundbreaking. So we've realized that the threshold for hate crime is significantly high in Canada. So that means a lot of hate incidents go unreported or unprosecuted, and basically nothing is happening. So what we've done is we have created this hate reporting system, and we call it system because you can report not just hate crimes, hate motivated crimes, but also hate incidents and acts of discrimination. And we go one step beyond. It's not just for those who experience Islamophobia, but for all those who experience racism, xenophobia, and basically hate based on their race and ethnicity. So here we have covered a lot of ground here itself. So why did we move? So technically this comes under the TIE program, that is Together Against Islamophobia. So a lot of people say, oh, so you're serving only Muslims. And the answer is no. Because we realize we're only safe as long as each one of us is safe. So anyone who is impacted by Islamophobia, but also racism, because you may not be identifying as Muslim, but you're also still facing the hate. So all that is included in our scope of this project. Other than that, we've tried to make it as accessible as possible, because anyone knows that Stats Canada will tell you, for example, that the estimated hate crimes and hate incidents is significantly higher than those which are reported, almost 5 times higher. So where are those people going? And why are those people not reporting? So we've tried to make it as accessible, as barrier-free as possible. So we have the option of people calling or texting or WhatsApping, because we realize WhatsApp is a very popular channel in especially newcomer communities. People can email, they can report directly on the website, for example. Reports can be made by the victim or even on behalf of victim or even as a witness. So we are trying to engage even bystanders. Reports can be made anonymously, because we know there's still a significant amount of stigma attached to being a victim of hate. Of course, there's confidentiality maintained. But here's where it gets really, really interesting, that we are providing not just the documentation, but also supports to the victims, one-on-one supports. What does that look like? So we ask each victim, what is it that you need? So some will say, I need advocacy. My kid has been bullied in school for their color of the skin or their religion or whatever. So we'll go to the schools, we'll take it up to the school board. It could be in the universities. Like, we had an incident in which a Muslim ablution place was desecrated by someone who just, thought it was fun. And so we went right up to the president and, talked about mitigation policies and so on and so forth. Some people may be really traumatized by what they've experienced. And so we offer counseling sessions and we pay for those sessions. Some people may need legal advice, and so we connect them appropriately to the legal resources. We have also paid sometimes lawyers' fees for people who cannot afford basic legal services. What else? It could be restorative practices. So it may say there's like hate between two neighbors. So we have collaborated with community justice initiatives who have for a program called SULA, which basically means mediation. So we have a bunch of trained mediators who are trained to deal with race-based conflict or ethnicity-based conflict. So it could be between two neighbors or someone saying some racial slurs. And so always getting the police involved is not the best solution. And so we want to keep all options on the table. And not just that, people can access these supports or report in 10 available languages. So if we don't have a staff person who speaks that language, we'll make sure that we get someone on board so that people don't feel that language is a barrier because of which they could not report. So we have tried to make it, as I said, as barrier-free as possible. And I will come back to this a little bit later in the session. But of course, this is a very, very resource-intensive program. And of course, we need a lot of outreach because this is fairly new. We actually completed 1 year in 1 year of this hate reporting system, and we released a report with the findings. It's called Snapshot of Hate in Waterloo Region, and what kind of hate we were seeing. It's a very, very detailed report, but not very long, so people can read it in just one reading. And I'd be happy to share the resource and links to anyone who's interested. It'll be very soon put up on our website, and it's a CMW website as well. So Snapshot of Hate is something that we really want people to take a look at. And I say all of Canada because we've talked to other hate reporting organizers, systems organizers, and no one comes close to even this idea of providing supports to the victims. And so we need support to provide supports, and I will come back to this a little later. Here are a few stats that we have about Canadian Muslims. This is like, for example, 94% of Muslim Canadians say that a sense of belonging is very strong. So we're trying to do a snapshot of what is a Canadian Muslim experience like. 89% of Muslims are very satisfied with the things that are going in the country compared to 56%. And again, I've got the references here at the bottom of the page. But here's where it gets really troublesome because 62% are worried about discrimination. More than a third have experienced discrimination, and more than a third believe that it's going to get only worse. So now we are coming to Islamophobia territory and how it operates and how it impacts people. Look at these, some more troublesome stats. So Radio Canada poll says that 74% of Canadians favored a Canadians values test for Muslim immigrants. And I can't believe I'm saying this in this day and age. And I've asked a few people who've been here for generations, like, what is a Canadian values test, or like what are the Canadian values, and it differs from person to person. And how are we supposed to test newcomers on that if you can't agree upon that amongst people who've been here for generations? 23% of Canadians favor a ban on Muslim immigration, and that level of support rises to 32% in Quebec. And we always say we are better off than our neighbors down south, but only marginally so, because 30% of Americans, but 26% of Canadians view Muslims in a negative light, and this number goes to 34% in Quebec. So these are very, very troublesome numbers. And we're not making this up. This is basically coming from very, very reputed organizations and agencies. So now if you go to actually understanding Islamophobia, unfortunately, Canada is the G7 country which has the maximum Islamophobia related killings in all the G7 countries. So although we may talk a lot about our inclusive atmosphere and our tolerant culture, we still have these horrific stats that are like marring that narrative. So we have the Quebec mass shootings, and within a few years we had the Afzaal family massacre in London, Ontario, across 2 provinces. And most people think of Islamophobia only when there's a loss of life. Let me tell you this, Islamophobia is far more insidious, and it takes place on more day-to-day basis than most people realize. So if you look at the Islamophobia definition, it's the closed-minded prejudice against or the hatred of Islam and Muslims. And how does this manifest? In exclusion, discrimination, and as you may see mentioned here, in extreme cases, acts of violence against Muslims. So most people will only talk about Islamophobia when they see physical evidence of a death or someone being killed or something like that, but not with the day-to-day Islamophobia that Muslims experience. And look at the third clause, or those perceived to be Muslims. Unfortunately, haters don't have a lot of nuance. And so unfortunately, a lot of our Sikh brothers who wear turbans and have sport beards are mistaken for being Muslims, and they are attacked or they face that hate. And I really have to give a shout out to that community. They have not distanced themselves by saying, oh, we are not Muslims, and so please take your hate elsewhere. They have very much offered solidarity and said that, this hate is not okay for anybody, irrespective of who they are. So again, those perceived to be Muslims are also impacted by Islamophobia. And now here we come to the most interesting part. This Islamophobia, most people think of only as, people shouting at you on the street, but it can be meted out by the state, by even institutions, and of course also by individuals. So most people think, oh, but this was a lone wolf, incident, that this is one random person who lost it and then, just took it out on Muslims. But as we proceed in this presentation, you will realize that it's also very insidious embedded in a lot of institutions and state sanctioned laws and policies. So although we have a full 7-hour anti-Islamophobia training that the Coalition of Muslim Women offers, so much as I would like to dig deep into this, this 1-hour session will not allow me to do so, but I just want to go through some of the elements that we do touch upon, like the roots of Islamophobia through the ages, and also like the persistent images that we find of a woman being oppressed, subjugated, and in need of a white savior, and of a violent Muslim man in the backdrop, a lot of destruction. And these persistent images that keep reaching us through various channels. And of course, I'm sorry, but I can't dig too much deeper into the dynamics of this phenomenon. So I will just directly jump into some of the more boring stuff, if you can call it that, the more technical stuff, the characteristics for Islamophobia, for example. A lot of people say Islamophobia is not really racism, and I just want to take a moment to address that. Think of a person who speaks with a non-Canadian accent, and I put this in inverted commas because I'm using a lot of terms which are just sad. Say someone is with Somali accent, and of course a Black person, and then they come and wear, say, a Muslim skull cap. And so we have 3 elements of hate that a hater may use. So on one hand, there's hate for that person's skin color, which is ridiculous, but it exists. There's another element of hate because this person doesn't sound Canadian or dress Canadian. And then there's this added element of, oh, but he's also Muslim because he's speaking, I don't know, he used the word Allah or Salam, and so he must inherently be dangerous. And so these 3 types of hate are intersecting, and they form Islamophobia, a very unique kind of hate. And so also I take a moment here to mention that most Muslims in Canada tend to be people of color. And so we can't really segregate and say, okay, this part was 20% racism and 20% Islamophobia. It's very difficult because we have this intersectionality in which various identities are merging into one person. So that person is 3 times more vulnerable, I would say, rather than just trying to segregate, like what kind of hate is it operating here? We see the impact is like 3 times worse. So that, and this is the Runnymede Trust tool to identify what counts as Islamophobia. So here are some terms which the Runnymede Trust has identified as, which are attached to Muslims or Islam without any rational basis. So if you think Islam as a religion is static and it has not changed in the past 14 centuries without any evidence or without any data to back it up, or if you think Islam is inherently the enemy, and some heads of state have actually said that Islam is the enemy, or fallen very short of just saying that, or if you think associate Islam inherently with terrorism or being sexist or etc., again without any evidence, or just because it's a bias or just because you think so, well, this is a good indication that you are in Islamophobia territory. There's a good way to check off and look at the impact. So anti-Muslim hostility is accepted as normal. What does this mean? So when Bill 21 was, kind of floated the idea that, Muslims, women wearing headscarves would not be allowed to, say, become a teacher in Quebec. We expected, the Coalition Muslim Women expected a lot of women's rights groups to come in our defense and say this is a violation of our human rights, and this is actually inherently a sexist law, and that it disproportionately targets women of color. That did not happen. We were very disappointed with that. We didn't get that kind of support, that kind of solidarity. Why? Because if the whole narrative is that, Muslims somehow deserve that kind of hate, you're less likely to be an ally. You're less likely to, step in. You're more likely to think that, oh, well, this hostility is normal, because it's almost like victim shaming. It's the only analogy I can think of is someone is sexually assaulted and you ask, but what was she wearing? And then the same analogy I see here, like, oh, Muslim women are like, targeted. Oh yeah, but then she's also subscribing to Islam, which is inherently sexist, which is inherently barbaric, blah, 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 blah. And, those narratives are forming the biases in the head, and they somehow, make a justification for all this human rights violation that's happening against Muslims, or Muslim women in particular. So anti-Muslim discrimination is defended, but Sharia law and the Muslims are coming, and all those kind of, very Islamophobic tropes, which don't, again, have any basis in reality or fact. Also to mention that, just because we have defined anti-Islamophobia does not mean, and I repeat, does not mean that Muslims cannot be criticized, or Muslim cultures cannot be criticized, or that we are above all criticism, or Muslim political states cannot be criticized. That does not mean that you're, if you're doing all of that, that does not count as Islamophobia. They're legitimate. You'll find a lot of Muslims also criticizing certain policies of certain countries or states, and that doesn't make them Islamophobic. Anything which is based in rationale and, which is justifiable, like through logic and, through stats and facts, those are valid criticisms. So a lot of people are afraid to use the word Islamophobia because, oh, but I can't say anything against Muslims now. No, you can make legitimate criticisms, but you can't just vilify Muslims just because of who they are. Let's make the distinction very clear. So I just wanted to put it out there. So again, what does Islamophobia result in? This is a classic example. Bill 21, Quebec's secularism law, the laicity law, is now considered the norm in Quebec because Islamophobia is normalized. Nobody is stepping up and say, well, this is state-sanctioned Islamophobia, which it is. I will put it on the record. It is. Because, we have this example of this teacher just last year in December who was told to leave her job in Quebec. And it is not because she did not have the qualifications. It is not because she had done anything inappropriate. It is not because she was not loved by the school or the kids. In fact, she checked off all of these. And yet she was told to leave. Why? Because she chose to wear the headscarf. So only because of who she was. So this basically the state saying, well, you got to choose between being a Muslim or being a Quebecer, for example. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, I will always be a hyphenated Canadian, and proudly so. You cannot break up my identity like that. and I tell my kids as well, it's okay to own different identities. I think it makes for a richer experience to be able to navigate different, worlds and cultures and still, be Canadian in the process. See, here is gendered Islamophobia, which is, again, something very specific to Islamophobia, which targets different genders differently. So remember those 3 circles I talked about? So we had racism, we had xenophobia, we had Islamophobia. Now we have an added element of sexism. And we know that a significant, I think the Stats Canada says that Indigenous women and Muslim women are a huge target for hate-related crimes. So again, it impacts Muslim women differently. So again, this whole idea that Muslim women are in need of a white savior, and so they're oppressed and subjugated and blah, 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 etc. But at the same time, there's this inherent need to somehow erase the Muslimness of Muslim women. So on one hand, we want to send our troops to foreign lands and liberate the women there. But on the other hand, we find the headscarf to be very threatening over here. So that is what is called gendered Islamophobia. So I apologize for this image. It is quite triggering, but this is the kind of stuff that Muslim women are often subjected to on social media. So again, the Muslim men are considered dangerous, the enemy, but the Muslim women are, assumed to have no agency, as if we can make our decisions. At the same time, somehow that Muslimness, the visible Muslimness of our identities have to be erased, effaced, or controlled in the West. So this dichotomy, this oxymoron, or this irony is not lost on us. So manifestations of Islamophobia, what does Islamophobia look like in our daily lives? So there is structural, systemic, and individual level. And of course, if you read about structural and systemic racism, for example, you will find different kind of interpretations of these terms. I will put a disclaimer here that this is how the CMW is defining them. And of course, it's not based on our own whims. It's based on, a lot of research, a lot of, reading. So I think of it this way, that structures they think of like a huge building, and they have individual pillars. Now, let's say each pillar represents a system. Now, systems could be, the policing system, the healthcare system, the government as a system, education as a system. So we have various systems, and then there's a structure which also has all the history, all the background, all the context, all the narratives, all the social, all the pop culture, etc., the cultural, social cultural narratives. So individual Islamophobia is fairly easy to understand. So you walk on the street and somebody pulls a hijab or says, go back to where you came from. All that will come under individual level of Islamophobia. Or like, some slur related to Arabs or so on and so forth. And I can give you real life examples. So because we have a hate reporting system, we are in direct touch with a lot of victims. So we'll have school kids come and tell us that, when we walk down the corridors, somebody will say, Allahu Akbar Kaboom. Basically just a slur. I have been asked by someone randomly who said, what is your opinion on Osama bin Laden, for example? Like, why would you ask me that? But anyway, this is individual level Islamophobia. Now let's look at, so all kinds of verbal harassments, vandalism, of course, property damage, when people go to the mosque after hours and just damage it and just put a horrific note, hate speech, of course. So all this will come as one individual operating against Muslims or Islam. So this is Islamophobia at the individual level. Fairly simple to understand. A lot of us have experienced this firsthand, and so can give you a lot of anecdotes and stories from our own experiences to which will help people understand what is Islamophobia at individual level. Now, structural level is across institutions. So fear and suspicion of Muslims. So again, all those narratives that we've amassed through years and years of history and Fox News and God knows what. So, this image of Muslims being as subversive, violent, harboring an inherent propensity to terrorism, all those things. So I find it very odd that, you would just stop me and ask me what is my opinion on Osama bin Laden, completely ignoring it. Like, what if I asked? So basically, I told the person, what do you think of the KKK? And she was like, why would you ask me that? I was like, well, well, it doesn't sound so nice when the tables are turned, does it? So she had this question like, oh, but if you asked me about Osama bin Laden, I said, well, I think and I believe that he was a terrorist. And she's like, yeah, but what about Islam? And what about the Quran? And he used all of that. And I'll say, well, what do you think of the KKK? They use the Bible as justification. So, you know, if I'm not allowed to ask this question because it's absurd, and of course it is absurd, because no one person represents all the evil that exists in any part of the world. You know, someone who identifies as white or Christian, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. But somehow it is justified for people to ask Muslims to you know, ask their opinions about some foreign policy or some terrorists from abroad, so on and so forth. Like, why would you ask me that if I'm not allowed to ask the same question, vice versa? So again, so that is individual, of course, Islamophobia, but then it is motivated by or informed by structural Islamophobia, because that person has absorbed all these structures. Now, again, think of that building. So maybe at the apex, we have all the historical context, what they grew up watching on, you know, maybe Fox News or some, whatever, wherever they got their news from, or, you know, all those narratives. And then think about those individual pillars, which represents individual systems. So this is basically structural Islamophobia is the accumulation or the compounding effects of all societal factors like history and culture. So if I had the time to dig a little deeper in the history of Islamophobia, maybe this would have made a lot more sense. So again, because that individual was informed by structural Islamophobia, they thought it was okay to, you know, ask me that question, as you know, and which turned out to be individual Islamophobia. So when we have this whole narrative of controlling the Muslimness of Muslims, you know, and then suddenly you see a Muslim woman, you feel, oh, I need to do my bit to put her in place, or I need to do my bit to, you know, basically funnel all that negativity to her, because somehow, again, victim shaming. You are part of this system, and so therefore you should be punished. So that is how structural Islamophobia operates. But systemic and institutional Islamophobia is within certain systems. So, for example, if you look at systemic racism, it is embedded within those systems, you know, and then so it is assumed to be natural, inevitable order of things. For example, slavery was supported by laws, you know, for 250 years. So it was embedded in the system. The policies, think of policies, legislations, and laws that are embedded in the systems. Bill 21 is a classic example of institutional Islamophobia, in which the laws and legislations and policies are clearly disadvantaging one group or discriminating against one group or putting one group in harm's way. Think of schools. Think of school as a system. If the school has a policy that all girls have to wear gym shorts for gym class, so it looks like a very harmless policy, but you know, you're excluding a whole chunk of Muslim girls who don't feel comfortable, say, for wearing gym shorts, and so you're excluding them for sports altogether. So this is systemic Islamophobia, you know, or something like, you know, there will be only ham be served at breakfast, you know, and knowing fully well that a lot of people will go hungry because they can't eat that for religious reasons. But it becomes even more serious when law enforcement starts profiling, you know, for example, MSA, that is Muslim Student Associations, and young Muslim women, just picking them off because they're Muslim and so they must naturally be, you know, have terrorist tendencies, for example, that idea, you know. So this is how systemic Islamophobia works. Surveillance of mosques, exclusion in academic institutions, discrimination in housing. Like, I will not give my house on rent to a Muslim family or a brown family or a black family or whatever, you know. I have this rule which I'm going to abide by, and that rule is inherently Islamophobic and racist. So this is a classic example of, again, systemic Islamophobia. This was a fairly recent report that was published in the Toronto Star by Stephen Zhou, and how major banks just cut ties with so many Muslim organizations. So overnight freezing millions of dollars access to these Islamic organizations and Muslim organizations. Why? Because no solid reason. A lot of things were just dismissed, all the charges or whatever, or, you know, the concerns were immediately dismissed. But for the longest time, those organizations did not have access to their own money. And I highly recommend that people read this. Again, I can give the whole link, resource list later to Iman. This is another report by NCCM and the University of Toronto's Institute of Islamic Studies. This is a report on the CRA and how it profiles Muslim charities in Canada. Very, very telling report. And of course, there is a whole industry that is peddling Islamophobia. And there's a local scholar from the Waterloo region, well, she's not local, she's quite an international scholar, Dr. Jasmine Zain, and she just recently published a book on how the Islamophobia industry is funded with billions of dollars and how it operates. And I highly recommend reading that as well. So how is Islamophobia disseminated? So common sources of Islamophobia, again, if you did the whole 7-hour training, I would be able to deep dive into each of these because this is really interesting how Islamophobia is disseminating. But of course, we are short on time, so I just want to, go over a few, and hopefully they'll, spark more conversations later. So we have some examples of how the media is covering, the news when the perpetrators of violence are Muslim and when the victims of violence are Muslim. So Global Mail calling them out here for sure. Hollywood representations, video games, vessels and Muslim women. The stereotypes are stifling and very boring, to be very honest. I already spoke about Islamophobia industry. We know that fake news played a huge role in the previous US elections and how social media companies were kind of complicit in how this fake news got out of hand in demonizing particularly some groups. And of course, online hate is a whole beast altogether. This itself would need like a 15-20 minutes per, discussion on how online hate operates. But of course, I just want to make sure that I'm touching a few topics. And so I hope this will spark enough curiosity for people to read up on their own, or, maybe take a, training from the CMW so we can actually do this deep dive together. I don't know. But either ways, there's a lot of information. Please make sure that your information sources are legit, because honestly, that is a huge, huge issue these days. So if talking about impacts of Islamophobia, so we have seen recurring issues that we have observed in the victim stories that we, serve. That of course there's systemic Islamophobia, discriminatory policies, laws that violate the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Canadian Charter of Rights, lack of systemic reports, so profiling, carding, biases and stereotypes when it comes to policing, when it comes to schools, for example. Stricter consequences for Muslims and people of color when they are charged. So it's bad enough when they are the victims, but it's significantly worse when they are actually the wrongdoers. So, but the law doesn't seem to be balanced in the kind of, it's not proportionate to their offenses. And the classic example is, like, look at the prison demographic in any of the prisons in Canada, and you will see certain minority groups are severely overrepresented. Like, for example, Black populations and Indigenous populations. Does that mean that, it certainly does not mean that, this whole entire populations have this propensity to, violence or whatsoever, but it certainly means that they are, prosecuted differently. So again, a whole lot of discussion that could just take place on just this, and how the profiling happens and how systemic supports are not available to people of color, especially even Muslims for that matter. Actions that people can take, systemic Islamophobia, be an active, engaged citizen, question legislation that targets Muslims, protect our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, hold politicians and law enforcement accountable and right. So everyone has a circle of influence. Please use it. And yeah, that is me. So when we talk about action plan, we talk a lot about how to train active bystanders, or how to become active bystanders. And then we go level by level, like what can you do at the systemic level? What can you do at the personal level? What can you do at the structural level? And I really want to be mindful of the time that I have. And so I've not, gone really deep into that, but I hope that the action plan, particularly with MLSC, is of some help. And yeah. Thank you.